Welcome to another episode of American Scandal Report. I'm your host, Oz Dalton, and today we're diving deep into one of the most shocking political conspiracies in American history, the Teapot Dome scandal. This isn't just a story about corruption, it's a masterclass in political manipulation, industrial greed, and the kind of backroom dealing that would make modern lobbyists blush. Picture this: it's the 1920s, America is booming, oil is black gold, and a small group of powerful men are about to execute what can only be described as the heist of the century. But instead of banks or jewelry stores, they're targeting something far more valuable: the United States government's most precious oil reserves. Let me paint you a picture of what investigators discovered when they began peeling back the layers of this conspiracy. What they found was so methodical, so economically calculated, that it could easily be mistaken for the work of a well oiled criminal syndicate. And in many ways, that's exactly what it was. At the heart of this web were three oil tycoons: Harry Sinclair, Robert W. Stewart, and Harry Blackmer. These weren't just wealthy men, they were titans of industry with vast fortunes and even greater ambitions. Together, they crafted a covert plan that rivals the most sophisticated confidence games in history. The scheme itself was deceptively elegant in its simplicity. Sinclair would take control of the Teapot Dome oil reserve in Wyoming, a massive government protected field. Meanwhile, Stewart, who headed Standard Oil of Indiana, would gain control of the nearby Salt Creek field. But here's where it gets interesting. Once both fields were secured, they planned to jointly construct a private pipeline connecting these reserves to a Standard Oil refinery. Think about the audacity of this plan. They weren't just stealing oil, they were building infrastructure to steal oil more efficiently. Through this pipeline, they would channel not only crude oil, but immense profits directly into their companies, all without competitive bidding, public oversight, or any regard for legal precedent. This wasn't merely a business deal. It was calculated theft of public resources, cloaked in bureaucratic procedure and political influence. But every perfect crime has its obstacles, and this one had a big one: the United States Supreme Court. In 1911, the Supreme Court had delivered a landmark antitrust ruling that broke up the Standard Oil monopoly, John D. Rockefeller's empire. This decision prohibited newly formed offshoots like Standard Oil of Indiana from amassing unchecked control over government owned oil fields. For our conspirators, this legal constraint posed a significant hurdle. Now, here's where Harry Blackmer enters our story in a big way. By 1921, Blackmer controlled an overwhelming 95% of leaseholds in Salt Creek through his interest in the Midwest Refining Company, an enterprise he'd built with fellow Colorado oilmen. Stewart's plan was simple: acquire Blackmer's stake in Midwest, thereby securing complete dominance over Salt Creek. But to circumvent those pesky antitrust laws, Stewart needed help from within the federal government. He needed someone with enough authority and, shall we say, moral flexibility to clear the path. Enter Albert Fall. Fall was serving as Secretary of the Interior under President Warren G. Harding, and he wielded immense influence over resource management policy. According to later testimony from Fall's own son-in-law, Clarence Chase, Stewart and Blackmer traveled to Fall's ranch in Three Rivers, New Mexico, for a private meeting. Here's a detail that should make your conspiracy detector start beeping. They arrived just as Sinclair was leaving. The timing wasn't coincidental, it was the synchronized choreography of a larger coordinated operation. Though no formal record of the meeting exists, and none of the men involved would ever acknowledge what they discussed, the circumstantial evidence painted a clear picture. These oilmen knew how to move quietly, bound by unwritten codes of mutual interest and discretion. They understood that the most powerful deals are often the ones that never officially happen. What happened next is a masterpiece of political manipulation. Shortly after that clandestine rendezvous at Three Rivers, Fall returned to Washington with a mission. He successfully lobbied Attorney General Harry Daugherty to alter the Justice Department's stance on antitrust enforcement. Let me be clear about what this means. Daugherty's office reversed its position, lifting the antitrust restrictions that had previously blocked Standard Oil of Indiana from acquiring Blackmer's share in Midwest. It was a decisive shift that allowed Stewart to execute his plan without legal interference. Now, was there an official record of quid pro quo? Of course not. These men weren't amateurs. But most historians and contemporaries believe that Fall and Daugherty were generously compensated for their cooperation. The entire affair operated in that murky space between political favor, private profit, and public betrayal. This is where the Teapot Dome scandal becomes more than just a story about corruption. It becomes a case study in how power really works when nobody's watching. But every criminal enterprise has its weak points, and the Teapot Dome conspiracy was about to discover theirs. Enter Frederick Bonfils and Harry Tamman, owners of the Denver Post, who are about to turn this oil grab into their own personal gold mine through good old-fashioned blackmail. After meeting with Sinclair in New York, Bonfils and Tamman realized they had underestimated their leverage, and Sinclair was about to learn this was an expensive error. On August 18th, someone named McCannery alerted Fall that Bonfils had dispatched 2 investigators to New Mexico, digging into Fall's past, searching for any dirt that could be weaponized against him. These investigators weren't playing around. They had unearthed the fact that Sinclair, Stewart, and Blackmer had previously visited Fall at 3 Rivers. More damaging still, they discovered that Fall had cleared the regulatory hurdles preventing Standard Oil of Indiana from acquiring Blackmer's Midwest Refining Company, and had granted Sinclair and Stewart that crucial pipeline franchise linking the Teapot and Salt Creek fields to a Standard refinery in Missouri. But here's the bombshell. They claim to have a witness who allegedly saw Fall receiving a payoff from Sinclair in his rail car during the 3 Rivers visit. According to their intelligence, this payoff was large enough to fill a suitcase with $1,000 bills. Let that sink in for a moment. We're talking about a suitcase full of $1,000 bills being handed over to a sitting cabinet member by an oil tycoon. Bonfils and Tamman weren't content with just having this information. They wanted to monetize it. They warned that the whole story would be exposed unless they got what they wanted. After their New York trip, they had broadened their scope to include all of Sinclair's allies in the oil industry, Fall, and the entire Harding administration. They proclaimed that their attorney would question the entire Teapot gang, including Harry Sinclair, Robert Stewart, Harry Blackmer, and James O'Neill, before the La Follette Committee. They planned to kick things off by taking Fall's deposition and exposing what they called the entire secret history of Teapot and Salt Creek. Their fellow Denver resident, Harry Blackmer, was going to be a major focus of their questioning. Bonfils ominously declared, "We expect to lay out every intestine of Blackmer's on the table in the committee room and examine them very carefully." That's not journalism, folks. That's a threat. However, Bonfils offered a deal. If Sinclair agreed to a settlement, the Post would back off and try to squash any legislation by Congress related to Teapot Dome. Despite the likelihood of the La Follette investigation continuing, the Teapot Dome scandal would mysteriously disappear from it. The next day, the Post published an editorial titled "So the People May Know," written by Bonfils himself. In it, he criticized Fall and Sinclair and the naval leases, claiming that negotiations between Fall and Sinclair had begun in Sinclair's private rail car near Fall's ranch, and had continued during later trips to Kentucky and Washington. Interestingly, this information was partially incorrect. Fall hadn't continued the journey with Sinclair, but had stayed behind to meet with Stewart and Blackmer. Sometimes even blackmailers get their facts wrong. The real breakthrough in unraveling this conspiracy came from an unexpected source, a reporter's conscience. On October 30th, during a month-long hiatus in the hearings, Sidney B. Whipple, a journalist from Scripps Howard in Denver, contacted Senator Walsh with explosive information. Whipple told Walsh about D.F. Stackelbeck, a Denver Post reporter who had been dispatched by Bonfils to New Mexico to investigate Fall's business dealings. Here's where it gets interesting. Stackelbeck had compiled a damning report, which was sent to the owners of the Denver Post and subsequently forwarded to unknown officials in Washington. According to Whipple, Stackelbeck believed his report was instrumental in Fall's resignation. But after the Post's owners met with Sinclair, something changed. The attacks on the oil deals suddenly stopped, and the paper published an admiring article about Sinclair instead. This is classic corruption at work. The very newspaper that was supposed to expose the scandal became part of covering it up. Walsh authorized Whipple to subpoena Stackelbeck and summoned him to Washington. During their November meeting, Stackelbeck was eager to disclose his findings. Despite uncovering what should have been the biggest scoop of his career, his report had been suppressed by superiors who were using it for blackmail. Stackelbeck needed his job, so he couldn't appear to be volunteering information, hence the need for a subpoena. It was a clever way to protect himself while still doing the right thing. While Stackelbeck was never called to testify before the committee, he proved invaluable to Walsh's case. In Washington, he briefed Walsh about his findings regarding Fall from his visits to New Mexico. He provided his notes, a copy of the suppressed report, and most importantly, notarized documents proving Fall's purchase of the Harris Ranch. Here's why this mattered. The ranching industry in New Mexico was suffering from a prolonged drought and falling cattle prices. Yet Fall, who was reportedly broke, had somehow managed to acquire the Harris Ranch for a hefty sum of $91,500 in cash. Where does a broke government official suddenly get nearly $100,000 in cash? Before departing Washington, Stakelbeck provided Walsh with a list of potential witnesses from New Mexico, all with knowledge of Fall's business and financial dealings. One name was especially notable, Carl McGee, a newspaper editor who, according to Stakelbeck, had the most damning evidence against Fall. As the scandal grew, it became clear that this case needed serious legal firepower. Enter Owen Roberts and Atlee Pomerine, who were appointed as special counsels to investigate the Teapot Dome affair. These weren't political appointees. They were respected former prosecutors with serious credentials. Roberts shared his impressions with Senator Pepper and President Coolidge, acknowledging that he wasn't certain he had completely eased any lingering skepticism Walsh might have harbored toward him. Their first day on the job included a visit to the White House, where Roberts informed President Coolidge about Walsh's assertion that Attorney General Dougherty's group had tried to obstruct the Senate investigation and had even threatened Walsh's daughter. Think about that for a moment. We're talking about threats against a senator's family to cover up government corruption. This news sufficiently concerned Coolidge that he discreetly assigned a team of Secret Service agents from the Treasury Department to assist in the investigation. The Secret Service, recognized for their integrity, would prove to be a significant asset. Roberts and Pomerine established their offices in the Transportation Building and initiated their investigation. They studied the Senate record, familiarized themselves with government leasing laws, and sifted through massive volumes of records and documents. But Walsh highlighted some crucial missing information. After President Harding's death, both Florence Harding and Dougherty had destroyed many of Harding's documents. Key individuals, most notably Sinclair, had also refused to share their banking and business records. On March 11th, Roberts and Pomerine traveled to Cheyenne, Wyoming, to present an application before Judge T. Blake Kennedy in the United States District Court. Their goal was to obtain an injunction preventing Mammoth Oil from operating Teapot Dome while they sought to annul the lease entirely. They then proceeded to California to initiate similar action against Dohany's company for the Elk Hills and Buena Vista Fields, presenting their case before Judge Paul McCormick in Los Angeles. Roberts outlined a clever legal strategy. First, pursue civil cases on the premise that the leases were products of bribery and conspiracy. If successful, they could then hold Dohany, Sinclair, and Fall accountable in criminal courts for conspiracy and bribery charges. This approach was strategic brilliance. Get the oil reserves back first, then go after the criminals. But here's a detail that shows just how brazen these oil companies were. During their train journey west, Roberts was joined by G.T. Stanford, one of Sinclair's lawyers. Stanford initiated a conversation about Roberts's future career plans after the Teapot investigation, enthusiastically advocating the advantages of working for Sinclair Oil. He suggested that such a position could provide Roberts with wealth, happiness, and a comfortable lifestyle. When Roberts later shared this thinly veiled attempt to influence him with Walsh, Walsh responded with regret that Roberts hadn't gotten the offer in writing. Even in the middle of a corruption investigation, Sinclair's people were still trying to buy off the investigators. As the scandal reached fever pitch, President Calvin Coolidge found himself in an impossible position. Republicans gathered on the presidential yacht Mayflower, along with influential party members, were urging Coolidge to take preemptive action against Fall, Dohany, and Sinclair before the Democrats could demand it. But Coolidge was known for his cautious approach. He had largely ignored or downplayed the Teapot investigation, taking advice from ex-President Taft to distance himself from the proceedings. In October, when questioned about the investigation, Coolidge stated he could take no action. A week before Archie Roosevelt's testimony, he told reporters that the oil leases were under investigation by a senatorial committee, and he didn't anticipate any other government involvement. However, everything changed with one phone call. While aboard the Mayflower, Coolidge received a radio call from committee member Len Root with shocking news. In a private, closed-door session, Walsh had told the committee he planned to go before the entire Senate and asked the president to cancel the leases and prosecute where necessary with specially appointed counsel. According to Lenroot, Walsh also planned to demand that Coolidge dismiss Navy Secretary Denby immediately. Upon sharing this news with his guests, including Arthur Prentice Rugg, Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, and Senator George W. Pepper, they all agreed that Walsh's demands could potentially destroy Coolidge's presidency and put the White House permanently on the defensive. The solution was pure political genius. Instead of waiting for Walsh to make his demands, Coolidge would preempt him by issuing his own statement supporting the investigation. At 7 p.m., Coolidge contacted his secretary, Bascom Slemp, from the Mayflower and instructed him to go to the White House immediately. He also called for Len Root and Augustus Seymour of the Justice Department. Since Doherty was conveniently on vacation in Florida, Seymour was serving as acting attorney general. By the next morning, President Coolidge released a formal statement asserting his full support for a criminal investigation and the appointment of independent special counsel. This proactive move completely disarmed Walsh's anticipated Senate speech and shifted public perception in Coolidge's favor. It was a masterclass in political damage control. Instead of being seen as reactive and defensive, Coolidge appeared decisive and principled. The appointment of Owen Roberts and Atlee Pomerene as special counsels marked the beginning of the end for the Teapot Dome conspirators. Their meticulous work resulted in multiple indictments and trials that would make legal history. The most significant conviction was that of Albert Fall himself. He became the first former U.S. cabinet member to be imprisoned for crimes committed in office. Think about the historical significance of that. For the first time in American history, a former cabinet secretary was not just charged, not just tried, but actually sent to prison for corruption. Though Edward Doheny and Harry Sinclair would ultimately evade conviction on bribery charges through skilled legal maneuvering and technicalities, the damage to their reputations and business empires was permanent. The scandal had exposed their methods and made them toxic to future government dealings. But the Teapot Dome scandal's impact went far beyond individual prosecutions. It permanently altered the relationship between big business and government in America. The scandal prompted comprehensive reforms in public land leasing procedures and significantly strengthened congressional oversight of executive branch activities. As we close this dive into the Teapot Dome scandal, remember, this wasn't just about a few corrupt officials. It was a web of bribery, blackmail, and audacity that reached the highest levels of power. Cabinet members, oil tycoons, and even publishers were all caught in a conspiracy that threatened the very fabric of justice. Yet the system fought back. Investigative journalists, determined senators, and relentless prosecutors eventually exposed the truth. But some of the scandal's darkest secrets are still barely known. Curious how far the corruption went and the shocking tricks they used to cover it up? Download the Scoob app now to get access to the full story and uncover the hidden layers of one of America's greatest political scandals. This has been American Scandal Report. Subscribe, rate, and share if you want more tales from the shadows of American history.